Last week we discussed the nature of the 7 nations living in the Promised Land when the nation of Israel came to conquer the land. We did this so that we could understand the nature of the ceremonial and the moral law. We learned that the cultures of the Promised Land were extremely polytheistic, that their faiths relied on the seduction of basic human urges, of sexuality, the need for food, the need to create a family, and so on. We learned that some of the laws given to the Israelite people were specifically designed to keep the Israelite people culturally separate from the other nations in the region, and that despite the draw of these false religions, the Israelites managed to come out as the only surviving faith and culture from that region and era. If you'll recall, I mentioned that many sources state that due to the vibrancy and draw of the pagan faiths in the Holy Land at the time of the Israelites, that the Israelites would be lucky to be counted as one of the gods among the many gods in that region if they retained their identity at all. These seemingly strange, culturally isolating laws were meant to protect the Israelites from idol worship. With that understanding, the issue now becomes how we discern which laws are built to separate the Israelites and which are actual moral codes we're meant to follow now. That's what we'll be looking at today. With an understanding of this, we'll be able to look at the teachings of Jesus and Paul with a greater understanding of what they're saying and how it relates to us now in the 21st century. Now, there are 613 laws and commandments in the Torah, and we will not be going through each and every one, listing which are moral and which are ceremonial laws. Even if we had the time, which we don't, I'm not sure I could even do it. At the moment, I think at least some of the laws require an understanding beyond my reach. What I can do is provide some of the principal ideas by which to abide when we're trying to discern the difference. Let's start at the codes and laws that are obviously meant for the Israelite people in their time and not for us, the laws of the Ark of the Covenant, the Tabernacle, and the Sacrificial System. We'll start the way the Bible starts, with the Ark of the Covenant. The codes on the Ark of the Covenant aren't the first laws given to the Israelites, but they're the first of the 3 mentioned, the Ark of the Covenant, the Tabernacle, and the Sacrificial System. Something that makes these texts difficult to process as you're reading through them is the fact that the detailed, meticulous descriptions of these items and structures can be difficult to visualize. They aren't written like a novel, but more like a divine IKEA instruction manual. So I'm going to put up an artist depiction of the Ark of the Covenant and exercise my skills as a creative writer and try and describe the details of the Ark in a more personal way. The Ark of the Covenant was a wooden chest made of acacia wood from a strong tree that is resistant to decay. It was used in construction of items and structures that were meant to last a long time. It gave the item something of an eternal feel to it, reflecting a part of God's nature. The chest was about 3 3/4 foot long, 2 1/4 feet wide, and 2 1/4 feet deep. The acacia wood was overlaid with gold, reflecting the majesty and the beauty of God, and also providing the Israelites a need and opportunity to sacrifice towards a physical representation of the beauty of God. The ark had 4 rings, each made of gold, 2 attached to each side, so that poles of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, could be used to carry the ark. The poles were never to be removed from the ark. They were built to be used for an elevated, blessed purpose, not for any common use or to be replaced by anything else. Like the rest of the ark, it is to be treated with the absolute highest respect possible. Atop the ark, acting as the cover, was a plate of pure gold, known as the mercy seat, and fastened to the top of the mercy seat were a pair of cherubim. You may have heard the word cherubim before in hymns like Holy, 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 but not know exactly what a cherubim is. It's an unearthly, heavenly being with a few different roles in the Bible. They acted as guards in the Garden of Eden, they surround God in Revelation, and transport God's throne in Ezekiel. And other than in the book of Ezekiel, the Bible describes the cherubim as one face with a pair of wings and 4 feet. 2 of the creatures were fashioned out of pure gold and set facing each other atop the mercy seat with their wings spread out, covering the mercy seat. Inside the ark were items of supreme importance for the Israelites. The Israelites were ordered to place the 2 stone tablets containing what we know as the 10 Commandments, known at the time as the Tablets of Testimony. There was also Aaron's rod, a key instrument used by God in the Exodus, and a pot of manna. Each of these has extreme importance to the Israelite people. The law represents God's guidance in their everyday lives. The rod of Aaron represents God's protection and represented by the Exodus, and the pot of manna represents God's provision. Something interesting about the manna, when it would fall from the sky, God ordered the Israelites only to collect and eat it for the day, and any manna that was left over and collected would expire overnight and become disgusting. Presumably, they wouldn't put foul manna in the ark, So if this manna has retained its quality against its regular nature, it would be another symbol of God's everlasting protection and provision for his people. The next big icon and structure was the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a special tent designed to act as God's home among the people of Israel. Now it may seem odd that the house of God, the Lord Almighty of heaven and earth, would live in a tent, but remember that the Israelites at the time were a nomadic people. Everybody lived in tents. So to them, a tent was essentially just another word for home. So just like the Israelites' homes were in tents, so too would God make his dwelling place among the people of Israel a tent, but it would be a tent appropriate for the majesty of God. The entire tent was 45 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 15 feet tall. It had a similar structure to the Ark of the Covenant in that it was built of acacia wood, which was then overlaid with gold, with no solid roof or front wall. The walls, such as they were comprised of rows of gold-plated acacia wood with rungs holding them together with poles on the interior, and rungs holding the tent covering on the exterior. The front and face of the tabernacle had 5 pillars of gold-plated acacia with a special veil covering it. A similar veil was hung in the interior of the tabernacle, separating the holy place from the most holy place. They were similar, both made from blue, purple, and scarlet dyed yarns woven with fine twined linen, and the interior veil was embroidered with cherubim. An interesting side note on the interior veil, the one that separated the holy place from the most holy place. When Jesus died on the cross, the Gospels say that the veil was torn. This is referring to the veil separating the most holy place from the holy place. This is symbolic of the fact that with the death of Christ, the barrier between us and God has been broken down. I'll elaborate more on that in a minute, though. And that brings me to the 2 parts of the interior of the tabernacle, the holy place and the most holy place. This structure was cared for strictly by the Levites, one of the 13 sons of Jacob. 12 of them became tribes, and one, the Levites, took on a special job. They cared for the tabernacle and were in charge of taking it down when they moved and setting it back up when they resettled. Only the high priest was ever permitted in the most holy place, and then only ever on the Day of Atonement, the day that the sacrifice is made for the collective sins of the Israelites, and even then only ever entered after having completed the appropriate sacrifices and sprinkling its blood on the mercy seat. The most holy place was the home of the Ark of the Covenant, the closest thing to the embodiment of God on earth at the time. The consequence of entering the Holy of Holies improperly was death, even for priests if they entered without properly honoring God. Non-believers tend to have a hard time coming to grips with the idea of something like this being so sacred. Without a God, the only things that could be sacred are things that have personal significance. So the whole idea that there would be such a serious consequence for entering the Holy of Holies sounds insane to the postmodern ear, especially when you consider that Jesus came to earth as a human, and that the Holy Spirit lives in each one of us today. It's a progressive narrative, moving from the untouchable with the tabernacle to the present, but as the other in the form of Jesus, to the ubiquitous self in the Holy Spirit. But consider a few things with respect to the severity of entering the Holy of Holies. First, we are working backwards. We're a people who are accustomed to the narrative that God is always among us, to the narrative that he is set apart and that dishonoring his place demands death. When we approach God from the perspective that our current state is how it's always been, we're doing so from an extremely arrogant position for one thing, but also from a very subjective one. If you approach this gradation from the perspective of an Israelite from over 4,000 years ago, who's being told that God will dwell in each one of us, that our bodies will be a living temple or tabernacle to God, they would see this as possibly the most intense expression of divine love possible. That's why I love studying things like this. I tend to relate to God on an intellectual level first, and elements like this, when you analyze them, you can see an undeniable pattern of love, even in something as dry as the ceremonial law of the Israelites. And that brings us to the sacrificial system. When it comes to discussion on what parts of the law by which we need and need not abide, the most obvious parts to disregard are the laws regarding the sacrificial system. We have all likely heard more times than we can count that we are saved by the sacrifice of Christ. Until Jesus arrived, the Israelites would atone for their sins through a variety of sacrifices. There were 5 types of sacrifices outlined in Leviticus 1 through 7. The first is the burnt offering. This is the most expensive type of offering since when it's burned up completely, with nothing left. Burnt offerings demanded a male animal without blemish, and various types of animals were allowed according to financial ability. When the sacrifice was burned up, the smoke was supposed to ascend to heaven to be a pleasing aroma to God. The offerings were meant to underscore prayers of petition or praise. These offerings were of cattle, goats, sheep, and birds. The second type of offering was the cereal offering, or the grain offering. These offerings typically consisted of 4 elements: fine flour, oil, frankincense, and salt. They could be brought to the tabernacle either cooked or uncooked. Unlike the burnt offering, the priest wouldn't burn the entire grain offering, but merely a memorial portion. The rest of the offering would be eaten by Aaron and his sons, since Aaron was the first high priest, and his sons would become the subsequent high priests. The grain offering would normally be offered with a burnt or peace offering, and probably served the same purpose as the offering it accompanied, whether for petition or praise, and could serve The grain offering would normally be offered with a burnt or peace offering, and probably served the same purpose as the offering it accompanied, whether for petition or praise, and could serve as an alternative to the burnt offering for those who couldn't afford an animal for the burnt offering. The third offering was the peace offering, which was the basic form of sacrifice on feast days. The feast days being the forms of religious holidays for the Jewish people. I'd go into more detail on the feast days, but there are 7 of them, and we still have a lot to get to today. It will suffice to say that there are 7 of them, 4 in the spring, 3 in the fall by the Jewish calendar, and that the sacrifice is a significant part of the feasts. Or it was, before the temple was destroyed. The peace offering was a celebrative offering which was consumed by humans, not by fire, for God. It was often paired with a burnt offering which was consumed by God. This was a time to celebrate your relationship with God, to reaffirm your covenant with Him. There were several types of peace offerings, ranging from petition to praise. This sacrifice would consist of cattle, sheep, or goats. The fourth type of offering was the sin offering. This type of offering would be for the purposes of making amends for one's broken relationship with the Lord. This sacrifice would emphasize the act of purification. This offering is different from the others in that the procedure is different based on your role in society. There are 4 classes: the priest, the congregation, the ruler, and the individual. The ritual for the sin of the anointed priest and the whole congregation are essentially the same, while the ritual for a leader and a common individual is the same. A core part of the ritual for all is the sprinkling of blood. The offering deals with the sin or impurity of the offerer, culminating in the Day of Atonement, the one day a year the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. Sacrifices here are of cattle, sheep, goats, and birds. Finally, the 5th type of sacrifice was the guilt offering. This is a subcategory of the sin offering, but this is specifically dedicated to restitution and reparation. The distinction between the offenses covered by the guilt offering and the sin offering are hard to determine and define. In general, the offenses seem to be more serious, and where the sin offering demands a female animal sacrifice, the guilt offering demands a male sacrifice. This offering as a whole serves to repair the relationship between the sinners and the Lord. Uniquely, this offering demands only rams. These are the basic elements that are obviously part of the cultural law. The significance of these laws is that they all point to Christ. The tabernacle prefigures how God will live among us. Solomon's temple later follows this model. As the Israelites have moved into homes of clay and stone, so too must God's home match the homes of his people. The Ark of the Covenant serves a similar purpose, to remind God's people of his presence among them and of his holiness. The sacrificial system also points to Jesus on the cross. Each sacrifice must be made with an animal without defect, pointing to the perfection of Jesus. I bring this up to help define and give context to the ceremonial law. When it comes to determining which laws are ceremonial and which laws are moral, a good guideline is that the ceremonial laws point to Jesus in some form or another, or, as we learned last week, any law that would separate the Israelites culturally from the nations of the Holy Land. So we have some context for the ceremonial laws. Let's get some context for the moral laws. In many Jewish traditions, there's a set of laws known as the Noahide Laws. According to the Talmud, a written collection of the oral Torah, these laws were given by God to the children of Noah, that is, all of humanity. Contrast the definition of the Noahide laws with the Mosaic laws, where the sons of Noah compose the entire world. The sons of Moses would be the laws for the Israelites alone. The Noahide laws are the following: do not deny God, do not blaspheme God, do not murder, do not engage in illicit sexual relations, do not steal, do not eat of a live animal, and establish courts or a legal system to ensure obedience to the law. Now, I mentioned that the Noahide laws come from the Talmud. a technically extra-biblical source, and that the list of 7 laws do not expressly appear in the Bible. Now, it's important when discussing these topics to start with the Bible and work from there. So why would I accept and then teach these laws when they come from an extra-biblical source? Well, technically, they're not extra-biblical. Each of these laws come from the Bible, exegetically derived from passages in Genesis. For the record, exegesis is what we're doing right now. That is, taking the cultural and historical context of a passage in order to understand it in the way that the people of the time would understand it. And if anyone would understand the laws made for the whole world as opposed to just the Israelites, it would be the Jewish scholars. So, great. That's what we need to know, right? We'll just start with the Noahide. Why not just start with the Noahide Laws? They're all straightforward. Even non-believers understand why we would have a law not denying or blaspheming God. They may not believe in God themselves, but it would make logical sense. Do not murder, do not steal. These are things that everyone agrees on. Do not eat of live animals. Specifically, that means don't eat of an animal that is alive while you're trying to eat it. Kill it first and then eat it. And that leaves number 4. Do not engage in illicit sexual relations. This is the big modern sticking point, and the part that requires more studying, as there are many laws regarding illicit sexual relations in the Torah. This is not a topic I'm overly fond of. My generation tends to see sexuality in a live and let live mentality for the most part, and while I don't see that as morally correct or logically sound, I can certainly see the appeal. I said last week that I'm approaching these topics with humility, so what I'm going to do is present the scriptures to you, present the cultural background, and leave the conclusions to you. There are 24 laws and commandments, or mitzvah, dedicated specifically for human sexuality. These are all located in Leviticus 18. One of them is not, but that one is only to not castrate any male creature, human or animal. The chapter opens with a short preamble. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you live, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules, and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. I spoke last week on the importance of understanding the people of Canaan, and how if we understand them, we'll be able to understand which of the laws given to the Israelites were made just to keep them apart from the Canaanites culturally. This little preamble expressly addresses that concept, saying that the Israelites will not do as the Canaanites do, but they will keep God's statutes and rules. So does that mean that all of the following rules are strictly cultural? That they can be cast aside simply because we don't live in Canaan? I don't think so. There are some laws specifically written to keep the Israelite people apart from the Canaanites, and which serve no other purpose than that. There are other laws that are only meant to keep the Israelites, and by proxy us, holy, and serve no other purpose than that. There are also laws that do both. And of the 24 laws relating to sexuality in the Torah, 23 of them are found in Leviticus 18. If all these laws are written only for the Israelites, then what good would it be when Jesus or Paul says to avoid sexual immorality? The definition of sexual immorality would be here, and if it's not here, then we just have to make it up. And it's like my ethics professor always said, ethics that begins with me must logically and necessarily end with me. Related to that, since 23 of the 24 laws are lumped in the same chapter, and the preamble we mentioned earlier, we can assume that these are what the Noahide Laws are referring to when they say, do not engage in illicit sexual relations. Now to address the actual commandments themselves. 18 of the laws in the Levitical sexual code relate to incest. The law, in creepily meticulous detail, lists every possible form of incest and forbid it. Specifically, the law forbids sleeping with your siblings, your in-laws, your parents and their siblings and their in-laws, your children, their in-laws and their children, and from sleeping with a person and their parents at the same time. Why each one of these had to be listed in sequence with such specificity eludes me, and I really don't want to think about it that much. The next law forbids sex during the menstrual cycle, then forbidding adultery. There's a law forbidding bestiality, and then there's the big one, the hot topic for the century it seems. It reads, You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination. I'm not sure if there are many verses with more discussion, debate, vitriol, and dissection done for it than this one. From my perspective, it being in line with the other sexual laws means it's clearly something to be considered as a moral law, something by which we must abide now. So we'll be starting with that assumption and working with some more nuanced points of view from there. The first point of view is the simple, modernly influenced idea that the verse is saying that homosexuality is wrong. The orientation, the lifestyle, the actions, all wrong, all clearly condemned rather harshly in Leviticus 18:22. If the point of view that we can throw out all of Leviticus because it was written for the Israelites is one extreme, then this is closer to the other end. Some would argue, including certain traditional Jewish perspectives, that this verse exclusively prohibits male-on-male sex, and that lesbian sex is permitted, or at least acceptable, because it's not expressly forbidden. There are a number of possible explanations for this, ranging from the ancient interpretations of what constituted sexual activity, to the idea that women simply weren't attracted to women, so lesbian sex just wouldn't happen. But similar to within Christianity, there are extremes on both ends. Details on this particular theology are hard to find, though the logic should be considered, if for no other reason than to be prepared to address them when discussing the topic. Others would argue that the overarching condemnation of homosexuality as an orientation is flawed. This logic has two fronts. The first being that the Bible only ever condemns actions. Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not sleep with a man as you would a woman," and that those who do are subject to the law. Not that those attracted to the same sex are subject to the law. Even rabbinical tradition doesn't address an orientation as being inherently sinful. So why is the question of orientation what's on the table right now? Well, really, the idea of an orientation even existing is a fairly modern one. The idea that someone is exclusively attracted to the opposite sex, the same sex, both sexes, or neither, is one that only came about in the 19th century. Until then, you weren't gay, straight, or bi, you just had sex with a man or a woman or both. I remember my Shakespeare professor, when introducing our principal textbook, saying that she was annoyed with the author for having written a paper in which he postulated that Shakespeare may have been gay. Not because of the theory, it's not uncommon, but because he said he may have been gay, not have had gay sex, implying that he adhered to a particular orientation. She was annoyed because it felt like he was writing it in that way, ignoring the history of the subject to get more attention and to get people to read it. If this is accurate, then the idea saying that the Bible would condemn a sexual orientation would be like saying that they condemn Protestants. They just didn't exist back then. How you integrate this information, if you choose to, is up to you. You can write me off as a millennial heathen if you like. I wore the badge of heathen proud in Catholic school. I'm willing to do it again. But these are the facts as best as I could research them. Moving on to a more comfortable section of the class, I've already addressed some of the ways of determining the moral law from the ceremonial laws. But there are two other passages I want you to keep in mind when it comes to making the decision of which laws are and are not meant for us. The first is what Jesus said in Matthew 5:17-18. Here, Jesus is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, just finishing preaching the Beatitudes, and he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Now, at first glance, that second verse where he says not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law, makes this whole lesson feel, well, awkward. If you understand the idea that the distinction between the ceremonial and the moral law is me saying that they should be ignored, that is. Remember that everything in the Bible is tied together. The ceremony points to Jesus, and that verse can only be understood in the context of the one immediately before it. Jesus has not come to abolish the law, he has come to fulfill them. He is not saying that these things and what they represent are meaningless, rather that since they all point to Jesus, they were incomplete until Jesus incarnate came to this earth. In him, they find their fulfillment. So we don't need a temple or a sacrificial system. We can eat shellfish and wear mixed fabrics because Jesus came to this earth. But Jesus still demands holiness from his people, and that holiness must be understood in the form of the moral law, which hasn't changed. The law doesn't make us perfect or redeem us. Only Jesus can do that. But when the discussion arises on what is right and what is wrong, the law is there to provide guidance. Finally, we should look at a passage out of Acts 10. The passage reads, "The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat, but while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance. And he saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air, and there came a voice to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. This passage clearly and distinctly states, 3 times even, that nothing God has created should be called unclean. And that, as Gentiles, we are free to eat as we wish. It's a clear demonstration of the fact that we are not bound by the ceremonial law, that we are free in Christ. Finally, 2 final notes on the punishments as prescribed in the law. First, these laws are strictly ceremonial, written only to dictate the culture of the Israelites. So, what the law says is wrong, as a moral law, is relevant to us. How it should be punished, as dictated by the ceremonial law, is not relevant to us. Second, remember that these laws and the way that they should be punished were limiting in nature, written to prevent overpunishment and to protect those who would otherwise be disenfranchised by their circumstances. Remember this, it'll come into play later. And that concludes the setup. We've done the foundation of principles for discussing the universal truths taught by Jesus and later retold through Paul. With an understanding of the Canaanite faiths, we'll be able to make sense of which Hebrew laws were written for the people in that time. With an understanding of which laws are moral and which are ceremonial, we'll be able to take a look at the teachings of Jesus and Paul in a whole new light. Next week, we'll be digging into the biblical model for marriage. Thank you for listening.